Okay. So adakah saya punya PowerPoint on display mode? Boleh nampak?
Nampak?
Boleh doktor.
Okay, so before we start our lecture today, let us recite kitab Al-Fatihah. Kita baca doa. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim. Ar-Rahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma ftah alaina hikmataka wa syur alaina min hazaini rahmatika ya arhamar rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. So for today, we will discuss about introductions to plant nutrition. Okay, so for today lecture, I will divide into 3 different topics, which are the first topic, the basic concepts of plant nutrition, and then we will also discuss about the classifications of plant nutrients, and then the last topic will be plant nutrients requirements. Okay, so for first topic, basic concepts of plant nutrition. Okay, so have you ever wondered how plant can grow so big? Kalau awak tengok dekat gambar ni, ada 2 pokok, very big. Plant can grow continuously. Dia tak ada time limits macam kita manusia atau haiwan, we have time limits. Okay, for kita grow sampai usia remaja saja, sampai 17 ke 18 you will stop growing. Okay, but for plant it will continuously grow, grow very big. I have once wonder masa saya sekolah dulu, because ayah saya ada kebun kelapa sawit dan setiap bulan saya akan tolong ayah saya petik kelapa sawit. 1 acre of oil palm plantations, we can harvest nearly 1 tons of yields of fresh fruit bunch. Okay, tandan buah sawit tu kita boleh harvest 1.1 tan hingga ke 1.2 tan. Okay, so where this fresh fruit bunch comes, saya terfikir macam tu, dari mana buah kelapa sawit ni datang? Kalau plant absorbs the nutrients from soils, okay, so setiap bulan hampir 1 tan lah elemen-elemen daripada tanah tu absorbed by plants. Tapi saya tengok, kalau awak tengok kat mana pokok tu tumbuh, keadaan tanah tu seperti itu saja. Okay, tak berkurang. So dari mana? Where do the trees get their mass from? Syairin, awak ada idea ke? Pernah tak awak terfikir?
Tak sure ada.
Tak sure. Mas Rizal, dari mana Syairin?
Ada carbon ke? Carbon dioxide.
Betul juga, tetapi kurang tepat.
Daripada air?
Daripada air, ya, plant perlukan air, tapi air tu nanti dia akan hilang through transpirations. Kalau diambil daripada carbon itu pun digunakan untuk respirations. So daripada mana? Okay, so at the end of this topics, first topic, you will know where do the trees get their mass from. Okay, so basically, so kita simpan soalan tu nanti. So basically, living organisms can be divided into 2 different large groups based on their nutrition. Where do the organisms get their nutrition from? We can divide them based on 2 categories, which are autotroph and also heterotroph. What is autotroph? Autotroph is organisms that can produce their own foods. Okay, for example, plant can synthesize their own food from by using light energy, and certain bacteria, microorganisms, can synthesize their energy from chemicals, okay, from ions and different kind of elements. And another groups of organisms is heterotrophs. We humans, animals are heterotrophs. What it mean by heterotrophs? We consume other living organisms. We get our nutrients from other living organisms. Okay. Basically, even though plant can synthesize their own foods, they require certain elements as raw materials to produce their own foods. Okay. These elements we call plant nutrients elements. Okay. Difference from heterotroph, the nutrients required by plants in the form of elements. Okay, kita adalah heterotroph. Plants is autotroph. Even though plant autotroph, they also required nutrients, but the nutrients required by plants is in the form of elements. Kalau kita manusia, nutrients kita dalam bentuk compounds. We required carbohydrates, vitamins, lipid, proteins, okay, that are compounds, complex compounds. But plants, for their nutrients, they required elements dalam bentuk unsur. Okay, so what are elements required by plants? So there are how many elements available in our nature? Berapa banyak? If you refer to our periodic tables, there are 118 different elements available in our nature. In our nature, out of these 118 elements, plant can absorb nearly 60 different elements. Okay, are these all elements required by plants? Plants must have these 60 different elements for their growth. When we do chemical analysis on different species of plants and we cross checks what kind of elements presents on the plant tissues, we found that plant must have these 17 elements. Okay, so these 17 elements we call essentials elements, unsur-unsur yang perlu for plant nutrients. Okay, so what are these 17 elements? So this is the elements. In this table, kalau awak kira ada 16. Okay, so satu lagi adalah nickels. So plant required these 17 elements. What are the elements? Carbon, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and all these elements include satu yang tak ada dalam table sini adalah nickels. So these 17 elements are called essential elements for plant nutrition. So what are the characteristics of these elements? Okay, so kenapa kita panggil dia essentials element? Because all these 17 elements share for these characteristics. What are the characteristics? First, plant cannot complete its life cycles without these elements. Okay, so if carbons, hydrogens, one of these elements absent in plant tissue, plant will not live. Okay, plant cannot grow. Pokok tak akan hidup. Okay, tak akan wujud pokok tu kalau tak ada salah satu elemen ni. Okay, so elemen ke-17 elemen ni perlu hadir. Itu adalah ciri yang pertama. Ciri yang kedua, no other element can perform the functions of the specific elements. Okay, so these 17 elements, okay, for example, nitrogens required by plant to synthesize amino acids, to synthesize proteins. Without nitrogens, plant cannot synthesize proteins. Plant cannot use other elements to synthesize protein. Only protein can be used to synthesize, only nitrogens can be used to synthesize proteins. Same goes to carbons, hydrogens. Plant cannot synthesize carbohydrate without carbons. Okay, kalau tak ada carbons, plant tak boleh hasilkan carbohydrates. Kita tak boleh gantikan carbons dengan unsur yang lain untuk produce carbohydrate, tak boleh. Okay, So that's the second characteristic. The third characteristic is elements must be involved in the metabolisms of the plants. So all the 17 elements are involved directly in plant metabolisms. Okay, what is plant metabolisms? Process occur in plant for plant growth and development. For example, oxygen is required by plant for synthesis of carbohydrate and also for respirations. Without oxygen, plant cannot live, okay, because respiration process cannot occur. Same goes to iron, for example. Okay, iron is required by plant for activations of enzymes in synthesis in synthesis of chlorophylls. So without ions, chlorophyll in plant cannot be synthesis. If plant cannot produce chlorophylls, plant cannot produce its own foods, its carbohydrate, and eventually plant will die. Okay, so the elements must be involved directly in plant metabolism process. And then the last one, reduced availability of element will cause disorder in plant. For example, the plant grow in conditions dalam tanah yang depleted with nitrogens, kekurangan nitrogens. So kekurangan nitrogens akan menyebabkan pokok sakit. Okay, it will show specific symptoms. Okay, so each elements, the depletions of different kind of elements will show specific symptoms. Sekejap ya. Okey, ikliman dah masuk ya. So awak boleh nampak saya punya slide lagi?
Boleh.
My slide on display mode. So we continue with our topics today. So each element, so we have 17 different elements required by plant for plant nutrition, for plant growth and development. So these 17 elements we call plant essentials elements, unsur perlu untuk nutrisi tumbuhan. So these elements is required by plant in specific form. Plant only absorbs this element in ionic forms. Okay, kalau elements ni wujud dalam bentuk-bentuk yang tak boleh diambil oleh tumbuhan, we consider that element is unavailable for plant nutrition. Okay, for example, oxygens, hydrogens, and carbons can be absorbed by plants from water and also carbon dioxide. For nitrogens, plant can absorb this element in the form of nitrates and also ammoniums. Okay, so nitrogens must exist in the form of nitrates and ammoniums for plant nutrition. If nitrogens exist in different forms, okay, for example dalam bentuk gas ataupun dia bind with other elements, jadi dalam bentuk tu tumbuhan tak boleh absorb nutrients, nitrogens. Okay, same goes to other elements. Okay, for example, potassiums are available for plant nutrition in the form of potassium ion, phosphorus in phosphate ion, calcium in calcium ion, magnesium in magnesium ion, for sulfur in a form of sulfate, chloride ions, ferrous 2 and ferrous 3 ion, manganese ion, for boron in boric acid or borate, zinc are available for plant nutrition in the form of zinc ion, copper in the form of copper ions, molybdenum in the form of molybdite, and nickels in nickels 2 plus ions. Okay, so plant these elements must in a form of specific ion in order for plant to absorb this element via plant roots. Okay, apart from essentials nutrients, what is essentials nutrients? Nutrients are required by all species of plant, okay, for their plant nutritions. Okay, different elements that if we supply these elements to plant will show enhance in their growth and yields. However, only specific plant that show this beneficial effect of these elements. Okay, for example, elements that include in beneficial elements adalah aluminiums, cobalt, sodium, seleniums and silicons. Okay, so saya nak tanya what is the difference between essentials elements and beneficial element? Zulharis, apa dia beza dia? Apa dia beza dia? So, essentials elements adalah unsur yang perlu. Beneficial elements, elemen yang bermanfaat. First, essentials elements are required by all species of plant. Okay, there are 4 characteristics of essentials elements. All plant, without essentials element, plant cannot complete its life cycles. The elements directly involved in plant metabolisms. The functions of specific element cannot be replaced by other elements, and then reductions or unavailability of this element will cause specific symptoms in plants. Okay, for beneficial elements, certain plant will show enhance in growth and yield if we supply with this element. Aluminiums are very toxic. Okay, so if the concentrations of aluminiums in soils very high, okay, for example in acid phosphate soil, the concentrations, the pH of soil will reduce. Okay, kalau aluminium concentration in soil very high, the pH of soil will reduce ataupun tanah menjadi acidic. Okay, so if this happens, plant dia akan mati sebab plant certain plant is very sensitive toward pH. Okay, when pH reduce, certain elements will become unavailable for plant uptake, so plant dia akan mati. Tapi ada sesetengah pokok yang kita tengok dia punya resistance towards aluminium very high. Okay, for example, Melastoma malabaticums, pokok senduduk. Ini kita akan bincang nanti dalam minggu ke-7. Ini untuk for your informations. Pokok senduduk tadi, they have high resistance toward aluminium. Okay, so what happens if we supply aluminium to pokok senduduk? We observe pokok senduduk punya growth akan meningkat. Sebab apa? Aluminium dalam tanah tend to bind with phosphates, okay, and become aluminium phosphate. We know that phosphate is one of essentials element for plant growth. So indirectly, when plant absorbs aluminium, it will absorb more phosphate. Okay, when plant absorb the pokok senduduk to absorb more phosphate, dia punya pertumbuhan akan lagi tinggi. Okay, itu sebagai contoh saja. Another example, silicon. Okay, silicon is beneficial for pokok padi. Sebab apa? Silicon bila pokok padi when rice or Oryza sativa absorb silica, the silica will be incorporated in their cell wall and made their cell wall become harder. So itu adalah menyebabkan pokok padi dia resistant towards certain pathogens, okay, fungi pathogens, okay, because for fungi pathogens to affect Oryza sativa, it will secrete certain enzymes to penetrate into plant root tissue. When Oryza sativa absorb a lot of silicon, the cell wall become harder, so fungi pathogens tu tadi tak boleh penetrate and affect pokok padi tu tadi. Okay, so biasanya beneficial elements yang kita kaji adalah aluminium, cobalt, sodium, selenium, silicon. So these beneficial elements only can enhance plant growth to certain species of plant. Okay. So any questions before we end our first topic? Ada soalan? Tak ada soalan.
Dah.
So, if no questions, awak dah faham where do trees get their mass from? Dah ada jawapan? Kelima? Awak baru masuk, boleh awak faham? Where do the trees get their mass from?
From the nutritions.
Ya, of course lah, daripada nutritions. Tadi kita bincang, kalau awak tengok pokok tu daripada dia germinate sampai dia besar, kita bayangkan pokok ni ya, dia germinate sampai dia besar. Dari mana plant dapat dia punya mass ni? Kalau dia absorb nutrient daripada soil, kita akan tengok sepatutnya soil tu semakin berkurang lah. Okay, sebab plant absorbs element from soils. Tapi kita tengok kalau pokok tu semakin besar, tanah tu macam tu saja. Okay, where actually the trees get their mass from? Kalau awak tak dapat jawab lagi tak apa. Kita tengok next topic. Okay. So the next topic is classifications of plant nutrients. Okay. So we know that plant required 17 elements for their growth and developments. How we know the 17 elements are required by plant? Because the 17 elements share specific characteristics. There are 4 characteristics to determine the essentiality of these elements. Okay, awak kena ingat first tadi, without this element, plant cannot complete life cycles. The element involved directly in plant metabolisms. The functions of specific element cannot be changed with another elements, and then plant will show certain symptoms if these elements lack in plant growth. Okay, so these 17 elements can be divided into different groups based on what basis we look for. Okay, for example, these 17 elements can be classified based on their sources of the elements. Okay, kalau kita groupkan dalam dari mana plant dapat elements ni, kita boleh bagi kepada 2. Okay, nanti kita tengok apa dia 2 sources ni. This element also can be divided into the quantity. Okay, how much plant require these elements. Okay, so if plant kenapa dia ada certain benefit kalau kita classify the elements into sources of the elements ataupun berdasarkan kuantiti dia. Nanti kita tengok kenapa. Selain daripada kita group the elements based on the sources and the quantity required by plants, we can also classify or divided these 17 elements based on the mobility on the plant tissue. Certain elements can be degenerate and translocated into other tissues. Certain elements cannot. Okay, what are the elements that can be translocated and what kind of element that can't? Nanti kita akan tengok. Okay, so there are certain kalau kita classify the elements based on the mobility. Apart from that, the elements, these 17 elements can also be classified based on their metabolic and biochemical functions, and also based on their mobility in soil and based on their metallic properties. Okay. Tapi biasanya kita akan tengok kepada 3 classifications ni saja. Source of elements, daripada mana sumber elements tu, the quantity of elements, okay, berapa banyak yang diperlukan oleh setiap tumbuhan, and then juga mobility of this element in plant tissues. Okay, so first, elements, the 17 element can be classified based on their sources. If we divided or classify these elements based on the sources of this element, these 17 element can be divided into 2 different groups. What are they? Minerals and non-minerals. What are minerals? What are non-minerals? Non-minerals are elements or nutrients that enter the plant through the soil or atmosphere. Okay, so non-minerals daripada sumber atmosphere dan juga air. Okay, bukan soil saya ubah nanti awak terkeliru. Sorry, from water. Okay, atmosphere. Okay, so what are elements that can be classified as non-minerals? There are 3 elements, which are carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. So hydrogens and oxygen can be acquired or absorbed by plant through water. Okay, whereas carbon and also oxygens also can be absorbed by plant through carbon dioxide. Okay, so non-minerals are elements that being absorbed from water and also atmosphere, whereas mineral nutrients are elements that can be absorbed by plant through soil. Okay, so ada 3 elements yang kita boleh kelaskan sebagai non-mineral. Dan selebihnya ada 17 kita kelaskan sebagai non-minerals. Non-minerals adalah elements that can be absorbed by plant from soil. Okay, so usually non-minerals are abundant in our nature. So plants biasanya tak ada masalah untuk dapatkan carbon, hydrogens and oxygens. Yang ada masalah biasanya non-minerals. So this non-mineral usually we supply to the plants through fertilizations. Okay, so non-mineral elements, carbon, hydrogens, oxygens are abundant in nature and constitute around 96% of total dry matter of plants, and generally no scarcity of the non-mineral elements. Among these, carbon and oxygens constitute 45% each, whereas for hydrogens is constitute approximately 6% of total plant dry mass. Okay, so that will answer our questions. Where do the trees get their mass from? Okay, so because we know that 96% of plant dry mass, total mass, is composed of carbon, hydrogens and oxygens, and we know that these elements are being absorbed by plant from atmosphere and water. So most of the mass of the tree are originated from our atmosphere, okay, and water. Okay, That's why kalau kita tengok, kita tanam pokok tu daripada kecil sampailah dia besar. Kita tengok tanah tu, okay, tapi pokok tu semakin membesar. Because only 4% elements are being absorbed by soil. The rest, 96% are absorbed by plant through carbon dioxide and also water. Okay. That is classifications of essentials plant nutrients based on their sources. Okay, kalau kita kelaskan essentials element based on their sources, we can divide elements into two groups, non-minerals and also minerals. Now, another way to classify or to group these elements is based on the quantity required by plants. Okay, so based on these classifications, we can classify the 17 elements into two major groups. The groups are macronutrients, macro mean bigs, or kita ataupun signify that ataupun merujuk kepada quantity, large quantity required by plants. And another one, we can classify the elements into macronutrients. Macro means small. It required by plants in very small quantity. Okay. What are the elements groups into macronutrients? First, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygens. Okay. And then another elements that being grouped into macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and also potassiums. And not, apart from that, magnesium, sulfur, calcium also classified as macronutrients. What is meant by macronutrients? These elements required by plant in large amounts, okay, a big amount. So what is the cutting point ataupun kita nak cakap apa? What are definitions macro and micro. So macro, usually the quantities of elements in plant tissue is more than 0.01%. Okay, if we conduct chemical analysis and we quantify the concentrations of element in plant tissue and we found that the concentrations is larger than 0.05, so that elements will be classified into macronutrients. Okay, so macronutrients can be further classified into two different groups, which are primary macronutrients and also secondary macronutrients. What is the difference between primary and secondary macronutrients? Both are required in large quantity. However, primary macronutrients will limit plant growth if the presence of these elements is small in the soils. Okay, so what are primary macronutrients? Primary macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassiums. Okay, so kalau awak beli baja, biasanya baja tu akan dilabel dengan NPK because these elements will limit plant growth. Okay, the growth or the yields will determined by these elements. If we supply these elements adequately or optimally to the plants, what plants will produce optimum yields. Okay. Another groups of macronutrients is secondary macronutrients. What are elements that can be grouped into secondary macronutrients? They are magnesium, sulfur, and also calcium. Okay. So among macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are known as primary macronutrients and required in proper ratio for successful crop productions. Okay. Later we'll learn about nutrients management on week 6 atau minggu ke-5. Kalau awak beli baja, biasanya dia akan label NPK. And NPK in fertilizer also ada difference ratio. Okay, for example, NPK 12, 12, okay, equal ratio. What is mean equal ratio? What is this kind of fertilizer required for? Biasanya equal ratio diperlukan untuk pertumbuhan yang optimum. Ada juga baja yang contains very high nitrogens. Okay, for example, kita ada baja 18, 12, 12, NPK 18, 12, 12. So kalau nitrogens biasanya diperlukan untuk pertumbuhan upper part, daun. Okay. Kalau phosphorus diperlukan untuk akar, dan potassium diperlukan untuk berbuah ataupun daun. Nanti kita akan belajar details berkaitannya. Okay. Secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, sulfur are those usually needed in moderate amounts compared to primary macronutrients. Okay. So tadi, elements can be classified based on the amount required by plants. Okay. If we classify these 17 elements based on the amount, we can group the elements into two different groups, macronutrients and micronutrients. What are the characteristics of macronutrients? It requires in large amount. How large it is required by plant? Usually, its concentration in plant tissue 0.01%. Okay. For micronutrients, it required by plants in small amounts. The percentage of concentrations of this element in plant tissue usually less than 0.01%. Okay. So what are the elements can be grouped into macronutrients? Carbon, hydrogens, oxygen, and then nitrogen, phosphorus, and also potassiums. And then we also have magnesium, sulfur, and calciums in macronutrients. Macronutrients can also be further divided into two different groups. Okay, primary macronutrients and also secondary macronutrients. What is the characteristic of primary macronutrients? Primary macronutrients is required by plants is in larger amount compared to secondary macronutrients. Okay, both primary and secondary macronutrients required by plant in large amount. However, if we look into details, the NPK, primary macronutrients, are required in larger amount compared to magnesium, sulfur, and calcium. Apart from that, NPK will limit the plant growth if the supply is limited. Okay, so usually NPK yang biasa ada masalah dalam tanah. Okay, that for macronutrients, dia ada dua subdivisions, primary macronutrients and also secondary macronutrients. For micronutrients, micronutrients are elements that required by plant in very small amount. How small it required by plant? Usually the concentrations of this element in plant tissue is less than 0.01%. Okay, what are the elements that can be grouped in these micronutrients? They are iron, zinc, boron, copper, manganese, molybdenum, chlorine, and the last one will be nickels. Okay, saya tak letak nickels dekat sini, sepatutnya ada lagi satu nickels. Okay. So that the classifications of essentials nutrient based on quantities. Okay, kita dah go through classification based on sources. We have go through the classifications based on the quantity. Now we discuss about the classifications of essentials element based on their mobility in plant tissues. Okay, so saya akan bincangkan 3 classifications ni sahaja. Okay, yang lain saya tak akan bincangkan sebab 3 ni yang paling penting. Dan yang ketiga ini yang paling biasanya mengelirukan, sebab if you refer to different books, the classifications will be different. There are elements that in certain books classify as element that can mobile in plant tissue, but in certain books that element is classified in element that can be mobile immobile implant tissues. Okay, so generally, okay, macronutrients except for calciums can be translocated from one tissue to another tissue. Okay, sorry, before we go what kind of element group in mobile and immobiles, what is mean by mobile and immobile? Apa maksud elements that can be mobile implant tissue? So we know that, for example, nitrogens will serve certain function in plant tissue. For example, nitrogens required by plant for chlorophyll synthesis and also protein synthesis. In certain conditions, especially when nitrogen, for example, depleted in soil, plant can degenerate nitrogens in all plant tissue and translocate these nitrogens into new tissue. Okay. Sebagai contoh, daun yang dah tua, dekat dalam daun yang tua tu ada chlorophylls. Dalam chlorophylls ada nitrogens. Dan pokok ni mengalami kekurangan nitrogens. Apa yang akan plant lakukan? Plant akan degenerate nitrogens in chlorophylls, and nitrogens will be transported from older tissue to new tissue. Okay. Dalam new tissues, for example, digunakan untuk protein ataupun untuk chlorophylls. Okay. Dia tak spesifik. Okay, tapi yang penting nitrogens daripada tissue yang dah tua tu can be degenerate into free nitrogens and be translocated into new tissue to form certain functions. Okay, so that means the nutrients can be mobilized from one tissue to another tissue. Same goes to phosphorus, potassiums, magnesiums. Okay, so based on these classifications, we observe in plant usually macronutrients except for calciums can be mobilized or can be translocated from older tissue to new tissues. Okay, for micronutrients, all micronutrients cannot be mobilized from older tissue to new tissues. So if we know that this element macronutrients can be mobilized or can be translocated from older tissue to new tissue, the deficiency symptoms of macronutrients except for calciums can be observed on all the plant tissues. Okay, faham tak? Okay, elemen-elemen yang boleh dipindahkan daripada organ yang tua kepada organ yang muda. Bila tumbuhan mengalami kekurangan nutrients ni, kita tengok dia punya symptoms berlaku dekat organ yang tua terlebih dahulu. Okay, for example, nanti awak akan belajar berapa sekarang? Deficiency of these elements will show certain symptoms. Okay, for example, for nitrogens, magnesiums and iron, the deficiency symptoms adalah chlorosis. Apa dia itu chlorosis? Chlorosis adalah symptoms where the plants synthesize very low amount of chlorophylls, the pigment that produce green color in plant. Okay, so when the plant cannot produce sufficient chlorophylls, the plants will show yellowing symptoms we call chlorosis. Okay, so depend on kind of elements that contribute to that chlorosis, the symptoms will appear either in older tissue or new tissues. Okay, for example, we know that nitrogens and magnesiums are involved in chlorophyll synthesis, and plant suffered from magnesiums and nitrogens deficiency. So kita akan tengok dia punya symptoms berlaku dekat organ-organ yang dah tua, daun-daun yang sebelah bawah. Sebab apa? Nitrogens dengan magnesiums yang diperlukan untuk chlorophylls, they degenerate dan translocate into developed tissues. Okay, and then ions also involved in chlorophyll synthesis. Lack of ions will cause chlorosis symptom in plant. Plant akan jadi kuning. But we know that iron is immobile in plant tissues, cannot be translocated from all the tissues to new tissues. So plant will suffer from chlorosis symptoms because of lack of ions. But compared to magnesiums and nitrogens, where the symptoms can be observed in all the tissue, the deficiency of ions will appear in new tissues. Okay, faham tak? Nanti kita ada lab berkaitan dengan plant deficiency symptoms. So nanti kita akan nampak dengan lebih jelas dekat mana simptom-simptom tu boleh nampak. Okay. So the knowledge of nutrients mobility, whether the elements can be translocated from all the tissue to new tissue, is helpful in the diagnosis of nutrients deficiency, macam yang saya cakap tadi. Okay. Generally, deficiency is appear in all the leaf or mobile elements. While if the nutrients is immobile, the deficiency symptoms typically appear in new leaf organs. Okay. So this is chlorosis symptoms. Kalau awak tengok pokok yang daun ni, it appear yellowing, okay, dia kekuningan compared to all the leaf. Okay. So the symptoms in this first picture appear in new leaf. So we know that ions involved in ions, magnesiums and nitrogens involved in synthesis of chlorophyll synthesis. This plant suffer from lack of chlorophylls and the symptoms appear in new leaf. So we know that this plant suffer from iron deficiency. And the second picture, the plant also suffer from chlorosis, because we know we observe the leaf become yellowing. But compared to the first picture, the second picture, the yellowing, the chlorosis symptoms appear at all the leaf. And then we know that the chlorosis symptoms usually due to lack of magnesiums and ions. But we observe the symptoms appear in all the leaf. So we can conclude that the second picture, the plant suffer from nitrogens or magnesiums deficiency. Okay. So ada soalan? Faham tak?
Faham.
Okay.
Faham.
Any questions? Ada soalan nak tanya?
No.
Tak ada.
Tak ada. So if there is no questions, let us take a rest for 5 minutes. Okay, boleh. Kita start 8.23. 8.23. 11.23. Okay? Boleh ya?
Boleh tak?
Okay, Doktor.
Okay, take a rest for 5 minutes. Hello, boleh dengar suara saya?
Hello, boleh dengar suara saya? Hello, boleh dengar suara saya?
Boleh dengar suara saya?
Dengar.
Okay. So let us continue with our topic of discussions. We have discussed about what kind of elements are considered as essentials, plant nutrients, and also what kind of element considered as beneficial plant nutrients. There are difference between essentials elements required by plant and also beneficial elements required by plants. Okay. So saya harap awak faham betul-betul the difference between essentials elements and also beneficial elements. Essentials element ada 17 sahaja. Beneficial elements sebenarnya ada banyak. Okay. Tapi untuk kita punya kelas, kita fokus kepada, untuk kelas saya lah, saya fokus kepada 5 ni. Nanti selebihnya awak sambung dengan Dr. Fahmi. Okay. We also have discussed about the classifications of elements, how we can classify these 17 elements. We can classify based on their sources, we can classify based on the amounts required by plants, and also we can classify based on their mobility in plant tissues. There are certain advantages to classify plant based on these different classifications. And then we move to our last requirements. Okay, so this graph represents the amount of nutrients required by plant, not required by plant, amount of nutrients supplied by plants, and then at y-axis we have 2 y-axis and 1 x-axis. On x-axis we have nutrients supplied to the plants. Okay, the below one here is x-axis, and this axis represents the amount of nutrients we supply to the plant. And then on the first x-axis we have the yield. Okay, and then the second x-axis we have concentrations of the nutrients we supply to the plants. So let us tengok satu-satu graph ni. Okay, so here the first axis we okay, dia ada 2 axis kan. Awak nampak saya punya cursor ni, anak panah. The below graph is the nutrient concentrations in plant tissues. Okay, so when we supply the nutrients more to the plant, the concentrations will increase gradually in plant tissues. Okay, kalau kita letak sedikit nutrients, the concentrations of nutrient in plant tissues is low. Okay, when we increase the supply to the plants, the nutrient concentrations in plant tissue will increase gradually. Okay, kalau kita tengok pula the corn yields, okay, okay, kalau kita tengok yields, dia punya graph berbeza. Kalau tadi the plants, the concentrations of nutrients in plant tissue increase gradually, but if we increase the nutrient supply, the yield will increase significantly. Okay, dia punya graph ni kita panggil macam sigmoid. Okay, if we increase the nutrient supply, the yields will increase significantly until we reach a certain point where the yields will constant. Okay, tertiary consumptions ni kita panggil dia punya yield constant. And then what happen? We continuously increase the nutrient supply. Apa yang berlaku? The yield become dia jadi apa? Decrease. Okay, dia tak macam the concentrations of nutrient in tissues. If we continuously supply the nutrients, the concentrations of nutrient in plant tissue will continuously increase. But for yields, if we increase the nutrient supply until maximum point, the yield will decrease. Okay. So for yield, for yield of plant, kita boleh divide the graph into different kita panggil apa ni? Different terms. Okay. At the beginning, when the nutrient supply is deficient, it is depleted sparse ataupun kurang-kurang, the yields berkurang. Okay. Concentration of nutrients in plant tissue also berkurang. Okay. So dalam pertanyaan ini, in these conditions, we call plant experience nutrient deficiency. Okay. And then if we continuously supply the nutrients, the generation plant tissue will decrease. And then the plant will also increase. However, this is not maximum yield. Okay. So this is critical regions where the plant actually experience nutrient deficiencies. However, the symptoms of plant nutrient deficiency is not here. Kita tak nampak kat sini. Walaupun pada hakikatnya plant experience nutrient deficiency. So this region is called hidden hunger. Okay. And then when we continuously supply nutrients, the concentration of nutrients in plant tissue will increase. And then the yield also increases until it reaches maximum point. What is meant by maximum point? At these conditions, if we continuously supply the nutrients, the yield will constant. The yield will not increase. Okay. So these regions we call sufficient or low concentrations. And then if we continuously supply the nutrients, the concentration of nutrient tissue is very high. However, the yield will not increase. Instead, it will decrease. Okay. So these regions can be called excessive. Okay. So this excessive regions can continuously supply the nutrients. What happened? The concentration of nutrients in plant tissue will also increase. However, the yield will continually decrease and plant will die. Okay. So that condition we call toxic. The nutrients become toxic. Okay. What is the means? The real definition of deficiency, sufficient, excessive toxicity. So this is very important in nutrient management. Different plant will have different concentrations of nutrients for it maximum yield. Okay. For small one, for example, the nutrient is not high as pampal, for example. Pampal is higher nutrients compared to corn. Okay. And then he compared corn to vegetables. Okay. Macam choy. So choy require a plant require nutrients lower on compared to corn. So different plant. The maximum, the optimum nutrients required for produce optimum yield is different. So itulah yang orang belajar untuk semua projek awal tanam sayur melalui hydroponic and also we will grow well through fertilizations. Okay. So nanti orang akan dapat nutrients ni berbeza. Okay. This graph also can be present for plant growth. Okay. So plant growth also punya graph macam ni. Saya nak explain. Okay. For example, kita ambil pokok jagung. At the early stage development, usually require small nutrients. Okay, why? Because dia sebab dia baru nak besar. Okay, dia punya mass tak banyak besar lagi. Tapi element stage, the nutrients required by plant for their growth is higher compared to the development stage. Okay, sebab dia nak masuk tu, dia nak keluarkan buah, keluarkan bagus, so dia nutrients required biasanya lebih tinggi. Nanti saya includekan dan graf-graf setelah minta maaf saya edit punya. And then that mature stage. So biasanya mature stage kita tak supply nutrient dengan banyak, kita supply nutrient sikit saja sebab the mature stage usually the nutrient requirements of plant biasanya dah optimum. And then kalau kita for nutrients and NPK, nutrient that the plant growth usually kalau plant berkurang dia boleh transfer from all the nutrients. Okay, so biasanya the fertilizer nutrients requirements also depend on plant growth and development. Different growth and development require different of nutrients. Different species also require different amount of nutrients. Okay. So this is the definition of deficient, insufficient, and excess of toxic. Okay. What is meant by deficient? Deficient is when an essential element is at level of deficiency that severely limit yield and produce nutrient deficiency symptoms. Okay, extreme deficiency will lead to the plant death. Okay. So if you read this graph, deficiency is regions. So this region plant get insufficient. Okay. Nutrient tak mencukupi. Ditanya dia tunjukkan specific symptoms. We have 17 elements. So each element dia punya symptoms sendiri. Nanti yang akan belajar. Kita akan discuss. And then insufficient. What is insufficient? Insufficient is the level of essential nutrients below the quite optimal yields, or when there is imbalance with another nutrients. Symptoms of this condition are really important. So insufficient usually is region. Okay. Hidden region. So apa yang menyebabkan insufficient? Insufficient usually due to two factors. First factor, of course, lah sebab nutrient sendiri kurang dalam tanah. Okay. The second factor, the availability of other elements is very high. Okay. Sebagai contoh, when nitrogen is very high. Okay. So it will affect other elements, especially the microelements take plants. So we will also plant SDH macam kurangan elemen. Tapi sebenarnya bila kita do soil analysis, we found that the elements are abundant in soils. However, why plant show some symptoms? Because none elements present soil very high and become toxic to the plant. Okay. And then we have also excessive. What is by excessive? When the concentration of essential elements is excessively high, very high, and the elements disturb uptake of other elements. Okay. So the excess of other elements will cause insufficient uptake of other elements. Okay. Nanti awak ajar dulu seterusnya. And then another very important management is toxic. So nutrients is required by plant, but when its concentration in soil very high, it can cause toxic to the plant. Okay, what is by toxic? When the concentration of either essential elements or other elements are sufficiently very high and inhibit plant growth. So excess extreme high concentration of certain element will cause plant death. Okay. So kalau kita tengok graf tadi, we refer to this graph. This is excessive. Okay. For example, we supply very high NPK fertilizer. So whatever happens to plant will not grow, will not show further increased growth and yield. Instead, it will show decreased growth and yield. And then if we continue this supply excessive nutrients, what happens? The growth and yield will continuously decrease and eventually can die. Okay. So that element become toxic to the plant. Okay. So why it is important to know the nutrients and medications? It is for us to know the amount of each nutrient is needed for optimum economic use. Okay, for example, later, awak jadi agronomist, we have to learn fertilizer regimes on certain plantations dekat plantation. For example, ada sedikit kita yang terjadi dekat Zambi, Felda, dengan saya tengok YTL. So jadi agronomist, we have to prepare nutrients for the plants. Okay. So kalau kita tengok plant dia punya growth dekat mana the initial growth and later growth. So the ratio of nutrients required by plants will be different. Okay. So this is important because plant fertilizers will incur cost. Okay, jangan kalau cost akan dibaca, dia akan menyebabkan management cost. So appropriate management will produce optimum yields, but we can save the cost. Kita adalah kita supply nutrients blindly. We hope that the plant produce higher yield. Instead kita tengok supply nutrients kita supply excessively. What happens? Dan we produce lower yield, dan kita dah keluarkan kos yang tinggi untuk beli budget. So tak efisien lah, tak dapat beri lingkungan lah syarikat awak kan. Kalau awak jadikan dan apa. So kalau awak tahu sawit at this age, okay, dia perlukan banyak nutrient, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We supply nutrients optimally, and then the plant produce yield optimally. So in that way kita akan dapatkan turunan yang optimum. Okay. Apart from that, amount of disease dulu. Why we must know about nutrients management, because we will know the nutrients removed by crop houses. Okay. So nak fikir tak pokok-pokok dekat hutan. Dia taklah dibagi, dia boleh hidup dengan subur. Tapi pokok kita perlu continuously supply, utilize. Why is the difference? Plant and leaf, jangan pampan plantations. Apa beza yang nampak? Senyap lah sama-sama. One nasi. Tidak. So kalau tengok pokok hutan dia boleh grow dengan subur, besar, tapi tak perlukan banyak saja. Kita tanam pokok sayur, pokok kelapa sawit, pokok jagung, tak perlu supply lagi. Sebab apa?
Sebab kita nak dapat pokok yang sihat yang boleh hidup untuk member kita.
Yes. Itulah itu tujuan kita. Tapi persoalan sekarang, kita tengok pokok dekat hutan, tak perlu banyak pun dia boleh hidup dengan subur. Okay. Kita boleh dapatkan dalam tahun besar dan untung. Tapi untuk pokok kelapa sawit, kita perlu continuously supply, utilize untuk pokok tu hidup sebab kalau tak dia tak dapat hidup dengan subur macam pokok dekat hutan. Sebab so ada satu perbezaan yang kita akan sebab satu pokok hutan tertentu dia punya nutrient cycle dalam keseimbangan. Okay, the nutrient cycle in equilibrium. What is meant by nutrient cycle in equilibrium? The plant absorbs nutrients from soil, it will grow, and then certain part of the plant will become senescent. Down, and then become senescent. And then you will fall off. Dia jatuh ke tanah, dia meleput. Bila dia meleput, dia ada microorganisms will decompose this plant residue, and then we convert to small particle into basic element. So element ini dia akan diabsorb oleh tumbuhan. So dia punya cycle macam saja. Tapi kalau tengok dekat sawit, kita tanam sawit, kita bagi dia keluar buah. Kita harvest buah tu. Okay. The nutrient supply is removed by the harvest yield. Okay. Dia punya nutrient cycle tak seimbang. Faham tak? Sebab apa? Nutrient yang kita supply itu it will convert into yield. And then ada of course last tempat plant dia akan grow. Jadi daun jadi jahat, and then jadi yield. Nutrient yang kita supply itu jadi daun, dia jahat jadi buah. And then buah tu kita harvest. Kan? So the nutrient supply is not dia punya cycle tak seimbang sebab ada yield yang ada nutrients yang kita remove from the cycle to harvest the yield. So this harvested yield must be replaced by fertilization. Faham tak? One assessment. Faham.
Betul.
Okay. So berapa banyak nutrients yang remove from the harvested yield is very important because we must replace that nutrient fertilization. Okay. So we don't want to excessively supply plant fertilizer because fertilizer application will need cost, and then dia akan menyebabkan yield semakin lama, but instead dia akan semakin menurun. So in order to express more, plant more nutrients it will be removed by crop harvested. Same goes when you grow vegetables in soil. Okay. So the same side. Kalau for example you open fields for vegetable plantations, and the first cycle you not apply can't use vegetables, right? Awak tengok dia punya growth sangat tinggi. Okay. Awak dah first cycle tu, second cycle awak tengok dia punya growth is not optimum as in first cycle. And then the cycle much worse. Dia punya growth dia menurun sebab apa? Nutrients dalam tanah tu was removed by the harvested yield. Tanam sayur tu certain nutrients incorporated like should harvest. So tak ada nutrient cycle. Sebab itulah kita perlukan fertilization dulu, pembakaran untuk gantikan nutrient kita dah how kita dah remove from harvest. Okay. Another important aspect that you must know in management is nutrient transformation within the soil. Okay. If you supply fertilizer, for example, awak ada satu pokok, you have a pump oil, and then this is oil pump is supplied with 1 kilo NPK fertilizer, 1 kilo nitrogen, 1 kilo phosphorus, and 1 kilo potassium, for example. So actually the plant will not absorb the whole 1 kilo nitrogen, potassium, or phosphate. There are certain amount of nutrients that will be transformed into unavailable form. Sebagai contoh, if we apply nitrogen to the soil, not 100% nitrogen will be absorbed by plants. Actually, optimum conditions and absorb 50% to 60%. The remaining 40% will transform another unavailable elements for nitrogen. It will lost to the environment through water volatilization and also leaching. Okay, ini nanti kita akan belajar lagi later. Masa-masa belajar so minggu depan. Okay. So it is important for you to know that when to apply the fertilizer. If you know that nitrogen is very susceptible to fertilization, so jangan tabur nitrogen fertilizer musim panas sebab the huge amount of fertilizer is lost to the environment due to fertilization. Kita tabur waktu masa musim kurang panas. Okay. In that way, the nitrogen supply to the plant will be absorbed largely by the plant. Okay. And then another aspect is potential mobility that might be affected by water quality. Okay. So we know that for nutrients, tadi kita dah belajar classification, nanti saya akan detailkan lagi. Kita dah belajar that plant can be divided based on their sources. Bukan plant nutrition can be divided based on their sources. They are minerals and non-minerals. Usually, nutrients supplied by fertilization is mineral, nutrition, and NPK. So this is an element for this element to available for plant nutrition. The element must be exist in ionic form. Why? Because ionic form is element in dissolved in soil solutions. So essential element, 17 essential element must be dissolved in soil solutions. To absorb the element. Okay. Certain elements, for example, nitrogen are very tend to absorb the environmental leaching. Okay, kalau terlalu banyak solution, kalau itu hujan baik. Kalau kita tabur baju hilang. Okay. Tak ada tumbuhan. The leaching was also leaching. Okay. So this aspect also is important for you to know, so that you know when the best time to supply the nutrition. Okay. So each of these aspect kita akan belajar details nanti. Okay. Understanding the principle of plant nutrition is also important for efficient nutrient management. Okay. So why you learn about plant nutrition? When you learn about plant nutrition, you know what kind of element required by plant. You know what kind of element is required large amount for plant growth. And then you know what elements must supply in small amount. So in that way you can plan efficient nutrition management. Okay. So dalam setahun tu kali belajar nak belajar dalam setahun nak belajar micronutrients, this type of soil, basically like what nutrients and what nutrients we must apply to that kind of soil. Okay. Itu semua perlu diketahui. Okay. Dan kita akan belajar juga. And then why it is important for you to know plant nutrition for profitable crop production. Okay. The crop production in India is not only crop yields, it also refer to phytochemicals produced by plant. Tadi saya dah cerita pasal kelawit. Apa baju yang perlu kelawit. Kita ada juga pokok yang kita perlukan sekitar for example kan. So this totally is very high demand in pharmaceuticals. So you know that what kind of sector like dia ada tongkat air itu. Okay, so if we supply this plant certain elements, we would find that the secondary production increases. Okay. So kalau like with certain elements, secondary element decrease. Okay. So dalam keadaan ini kita punya yield, kita keadaan akan hasilkan buah, tapi kita tak dapat buah tu kita maksimalkan ini boleh. So the nutrient regime for this plant will be different. Okay. Banyak tangkap sawit jauh-jauh kita tak ini tadi. So this is very important to know dan so that you can increase, you can produce yield. This is situation only fruits ataupun tapi kita buat also dia punya very baik dan yield. Okay. Plant management also why must learn plant management for environmental protection. Okay. The nutrients we supply to the plant. Tadi saya cakap is not 100% will be absorbed by the plant. Okay. Apart from the nutrients we really need, we lost the environment through the change of globalizations and different way. So these elements that lost the environment cause environment pollution. Okay. Awak menggunakan logik orang air di tingkat amonia terlampau tinggi. So salah satu pencemaran amonia ini adalah kawasan peladangan melalui fertilization, excessive fertilization. Okay. So if you apply fertilizer indiscriminately, it will cause environmental pollution. Selain daripada pencemaran air, excessive fertilizer, excessive fertilization also can cause greenhouse effects. Itu juga dapat macam. Okay. So masa saya teruskan sebab kita dah banyak slide. There are different ways to analyze plant efficiency. Okay. Sama-sama kita tahu plant tu dia get optimum produce or not. We can conduct certain analysis. For example, we can use visual analysis because the symptoms analysis can be also applied. You can also do plant analysis by visual analysis. Contoh plant analysis kita boleh menggunakan ICP, OES ataupun OES determining concentration in plant. For example, we know that the nitrogen concentration must be higher than 1%. When we do chemical analysis, we found that the concentration of nitrogen and samples lower than we know that plants are performed with nitrogen efficiency. Okay. So analysis is only to determine the nutrients, the availability of nutrients. We know that plant require essential elements, and then these essential elements must exist in certain ionic conditions in order for plant to absorb this element. For example, phosphorus must exist in soil in the form of phosphate. So when we do chemical analysis, we found that the phosphorus in our soil exists in aluminum phosphate, calcium phosphate, iron phosphate, for example. So we know that in this kind of conditions, the phosphate will not be available for plant systems. Okay. So we must do nutrient management to increase the phosphorus concentration. Okay. By chemical analysis, contoh by chemical analysis that can be conducted to determine the nutrient condition and is chloroform content, for example. Okay. So we have normal one, and then we have our samples, and then we compare in our samples the chloroform content is low. So that will confirm our visual observations when we look the plant leaf becoming green. Okay. So we will look which part the chlorosis appear lower part or at the upper part. If the biological systems, cortical systems, PAD, apa newly developed leaf. We know that the plants are from microorganisms, and microorganisms involved in photosynthesis iron. So in that we know that these plants suffer from iron deficiency. Okay. So I think we have dah pukul 12 lah sekarang. So saya berhenti sekali saja. Minggu depan kita akan sama-sama tak banyak ini, mungkin dalam 10 atau 15 minit kita boleh habiskan. Okay. So any questions before we end our class for today? Ada soalan? Questions? Any question? Tak kena tahu soalan apa?